My name is Jill Morgan, and I'm 31 years old. This happened about 6 months ago in Redwood National Park, nestled in the northwestern corner of California. I still can't get the images out of my head. The towering trees, the perpetual twilight under their canopy, and the thing we found lurking among them. People have called me crazy since I told them what happened, but I need to get it down as clearly as possible. Maybe then I can sleep without seeing that twisted silhouette behind every shadow. I had always dreamed of taking the perfect photograph of those redwood giants. As a passionate nature photographer, I tend to fixate on certain projects until I can capture them the way I see them in my head. Those tall, ancient trees were calling me for years. It was autumn, the tourist season had died down, and the park was pleasantly empty. I figured it would be an ideal time to avoid the crowds, set up camp, and roam the trails unbothered. 3 friends of mine joined me for the trip in an old RV we had rented for the weekend. It was a tradition of ours to embark on mini-adventures whenever we had overlapping free time. First, there was Kevin, a friend from my college days. Kevin's the kind of guy who never stops talking, charismatic, a class clown who always wants to lighten the mood. Although in some moments, especially tense ones, his jokes felt more like a barrier to keep reality at bay. Then there was Diana, the calm one in our group, the person who always tries to find a compromise. She can soothe arguments and keep everyone grounded, but beneath her composure, she sometimes hides a quiet fear of everything going horribly wrong. Last but not least was Chris, a resourceful outdoorsman. He prided himself on his expert-level camping skills. If there was an argument about how to light the perfect fire or which trail to follow, Chris had a firm opinion. Despite his somewhat overbearing manner, he was usually the one people turned to when equipment failed or problems arose. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we texted constantly, planning the route we'd take, the gear we'd bring, and, most important to me, the photography spots I wanted to visit. Kevin kept sending us articles about legends in Redwood National Park, especially cryptic references to shapeshifters or malevolent forest spirits from local Native American folklore. Some of these articles mentioned people disappearing or going mad after hearing voices in the woods. Chris dismissed it all as sensational tabloid nonsense, while Diana rolled her eyes and said it was just Kevin trying to spook everyone. But I noticed Kevin was a little too interested. It was more than a casual joke for him. We left on a Friday morning, the drive taking most of the day. By the time we arrived at the edge of the park, late afternoon sunlight slanted through the branches of ancient redwoods. Some of these trees are hundreds of feet tall, so thick and majestic that the ground below is cast in a sort of perpetual dusk, even on a bright day. The temperature had dropped faster than we expected. The weather report warned of a cold snap rolling through, bringing nightly fog. I shivered as I stepped out of the RV, not quite dressed for the chill. Our campsite was remote, far from the usual tourist sections. We'd reserved a space at a lesser-known campground near a rarely used trail, exactly what I wanted to ensure undisturbed photography sessions. Chris backed the RV into a flat clearing, surrounded by redwoods, so dense they formed a wall of bark around us. We found a ring of stones for a fire pit and a metal stand for cooking. There was a solitary lantern post, rusted at the base, leaning like it could topple at any moment. The place gave me a faint sense of unease, though I wrote it off as excitement. After all, it's not every day I get the chance to photograph something so grand. While Chris and Diana set up the tent extension and unrolled sleeping bags, Kevin entertained himself by exploring the immediate perimeter, shining a flashlight into dark corners even though we still had a good hour of daylight left. I opened my camera case to prep my gear. That was when I noticed the unfortunate reality. My best wide-angle lens, the one I'd planned to rely on for capturing those towering trees in all their glory, had cracked during the bumpy ride. I felt a pang in my chest. I had a backup lens, of course, but it wasn't the same quality. Kevin strolled back, saw me fussing over the broken glass, and patted me on the shoulder with mock pity. "Looks like the Redwood ghosts already got you, Jill," he said with a grin that was half sympathy, half amusement. Kidding, obviously. I half laughed, half sighed, trying to keep my spirits up. "No Redwood ghost is going to stop me," I said, slipping on the backup lens. We managed to get a decent fire going as night settled in. The temperature dropped sharply and the hush of the forest was almost absolute. I kept listening for the usual nighttime cacophony of insects, but it just wasn't there. We ate a quick dinner, courtesy of Chris's brand new camping stove, which promptly sputtered and died halfway through cooking. We had to finish the meal using a tiny backup burner. Chris grumbled and fiddled with valves and settings, cursing the faulty equipment, but to no avail. Everyone seemed on edge, though we tried to chalk it up to the cold and the frustration of minor mishaps. Kevin, always the entertainer, launched into scary stories around the campfire, tales of witches and forest spirits in Redwood. He had a flair for drama, and I saw that little flicker of fascination in his eyes when he reached the part about how spirits can imitate voices to lure unsuspecting hikers away. Diana cut in, telling him to lighten up. She said the last thing we needed was to psych ourselves out. Chris nodded in agreement, stony-faced as ever, as if Kevin's tales might actually rattle him more than he cared to admit. When the fire burned low, we all decided to get some sleep. The plan was to head out early the next morning on a long hike through the lesser-traveled trails. We wanted to catch the morning light slicing through the treetops. I set up my sleeping bag in the RV while the others did likewise. Chris insisted on sleeping outside in the tent he'd pitched next to the vehicle. He liked to brag that he could handle any temperature. I wasn't about to argue. My fingers were already numb. The night was colder than I expected. I woke sometime, after midnight, to complete silence. My breath came out in smoky puffs. The quiet was too heavy, almost suffocating. Normally, I wouldn't have worried, but there was something about the hush that set the hairs on my neck upright. I reached for my phone and saw it was just past 2 in the morning. The faint glow of moonlight through the RV window cast pale ribbons across the floor. Then I heard it. A faint scraping against the side of the RV. At first, I thought maybe a branch was rubbing in the wind, but when I looked out the window, I saw no branches near enough to scratch. The redwood trunks were a good few yards away. The scraping came again, slower this time, like nails dragging on metal. My heart thumped violently in my chest. I debated waking the others. Chris was outside, presumably asleep in his tent. I didn't want to freak anyone out over a sound I wasn't entirely sure of myself. Gathering my courage, I crept to the door and peeked out. The darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of the RV's small exterior light. Silence again, so profound it was dizzying. I forced myself to exhale and went back to my sleeping bag, convincing myself it was nothing but my nerves. As I lay there, the wind picked up ever so slightly, a cold gust that made the tall redwoods groan. I told myself to sleep. In the morning, I woke to find Chris in a particularly foul mood. Something had apparently spooked him during the night, too. He complained about hearing footsteps circling his tent and was convinced Kevin had been pranking him. Kevin, for his part, swore up and down he hadn't left the RV. Diana, always the peacemaker, suggested maybe it was an animal. Chris just grunted something about, "No normal animal makes footsteps like that." After breakfast, we decided to go on our planned hike. That was the whole reason we'd come after all, to explore the lesser-known trail. I slung my camera around my neck, determined to make the best of the backup lens. Kevin's sense of adventure returned, and he bounded ahead, occasionally calling back, "Jill, you gotta see the way the light hits this spot." Or, "We're gonna find that redwood witch. I can feel it in my bones." Diana rolled her eyes, but followed close behind, calmly scanning the path for anything interesting. Chris took the rear, occasionally muttering about wanting to find real wildlife to photograph. The trees in Redwood National Park are colossal. They blot out much of the sky, and the ground is thick with ferns and moss. There's a sense of stepping into an ancient cathedral, with columns of bark that have stood for centuries. The air felt damp and thick as we ventured deeper, the morning, fog lingering longer than usual. I snapped photo after photo, grateful for the subdued but magical light. Diana pointed out a cluster of mushrooms near a fallen log, and Kevin spotted some deer tracks. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful, even tranquil, as though last night's fears had been illusions. Then we stumbled upon something strange, a clearing with a large fallen trunk, its bark carved with odd symbols. They weren't typical graffiti, no initials or hearts, but rather spirals and strange geometric shapes. Circles of stones surrounded a charred patch of earth, looking like a long extinguished fire pit. Kevin smirked. "Witch's barbecue," he announced with mock solemnity, but his voice held a genuine undertone of curiosity. Diana urged us to move on. She said the vibe here was off, and I had to agree. Chris, naturally, dismissed it as some teenagers messing around. We continued the hike until early afternoon. By then, the cold had begun to seep into my bones, and we all felt hungry. We decided to head back to camp, find something warm to eat, and plan for a shorter trek near sunset. Maybe I'd get some moody twilight shots among the trunks. On our way back, we bumped into an older park ranger who gave us a friendly but concerned greeting. He asked if we had everything we needed and cautioned us not to stray too far after dark. Something about his tone made me uneasy, like he wanted to say more but held back. Kevin, never shy, asked the ranger if he believed in the redwood shapeshifter stuff. The ranger just frowned and said, "Best keep to the main trails," before walking away with a subtle shake of his head. Back at camp, Chris tried again to fix his stove, but it remained stubbornly silent. We settled for a simple lunch over, the small backup burner, while Kevin kept teasing Chris that his fancy outdoorsman gear was letting him down. Chris shot Kevin a withering glare. Diana stepped in, trying to diffuse any potential argument, but it was clear the tension was growing. Kevin's jokes were borderline taunting. Chris's pride was wounded, and he didn't appreciate being ridiculed. That evening, the fog rolled in heavy and dense. We built up the campfire as best we could, though the wood was damp. Kevin rummaged in his backpack for marshmallows he claimed to have brought, but all he produced was a half-finished bag of stale crackers. The mood was less festive than we had hoped, overshadowed by lingering doubts and the strange events of the previous night. As darkness settled, the hush returned. It felt like the forest itself was leaning in, listening. I found myself glancing around, half expecting to see someone or something moving among the trees. The flicker of the fire cast wavering shadows that made everything look alive. I caught Diana staring into the darkness, her lips pressed tight, her eyes flickering with what I recognized as apprehension. Kevin, trying to lighten the mood, started telling more creepy stories. He couldn't help himself. He insisted Redwood National Park had a special pull for supernatural entities, especially around the late autumn months. According to him, ancient spirits were rumored to roam these woods, sometimes appearing as animals, other times as distorted versions of people. Chris told him to shut it. He said we were scaring ourselves for nothing. Kevin shrugged, continuing, all the same. Only when Chris threatened to dump a pot of cold water on him did Kevin finally zip his lips. Somewhere around 11, the wind kicked up again, and we heard branches groan in the distance. I took a few night shots of our campsite, playing with long exposure. Most of the pictures came out as murky blurs. Then, in one shot, I could have sworn I captured a pale figure in the background, near a cluster of ferns. The shape was elongated, almost human, but I couldn't be sure. It might have been a trick of the light, a motion blur. I didn't dare mention it out loud. The group was already tense, and I didn't want to add to the hysteria. We called it a night, deciding to turn in. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the broken lens, the strange clearing, the ranger's warning, and that possible shape in my photo. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, Chris was banging on the RV door, looking frantic. He said Kevin was missing. I jolted awake, my heart hammering. Diana was already by the door, pulling on a jacket. The three of us hurried outside with flashlights, calling Kevin's name. The night was bitterly cold, the fog so thick our beams of light reached only a few feet before being swallowed. My stomach twisted at the thought of Kevin stumbling around in this darkness. "Kevin, this isn't funny!" Chris bellowed. "You better not be messing with us!" We fanned out around the campsite. Diana found footprints leading away from the RV, deeper into the woods. They looked fresh. We followed them for maybe 50 yards until they abruptly stopped near a huge redwood trunk. There was no sign of Kevin, no footprints returning, no scuff marks to indicate he'd turned around. It was like he had just vanished. We called his name over and over, the sound bouncing back at us from the trees. Cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. Diana's hands shook around her flashlight, but she tried to stay composed, urging us not to panic. Chris's breath was labored, his frustration turning to fear. All we could do was keep searching. Eventually, after what felt like hours of combing through the undergrowth, we returned to camp, hoping, praying, that maybe Kevin had wandered back. Just before dawn, he showed up. He staggered into the clearing like a drunk, his eyes wide and unfocused. We rushed to him, bombarding him with questions. Where had he gone? Why did he leave? What happened? Kevin's face was ashen, and he mumbled something about eyes in the trees and someone calling me. When pressed, he couldn't recall any concrete details, only that he heard a voice that sounded like mine calling him deeper into the woods, repeating his name in a hushed whisper. After a while, he felt disoriented, like he had blacked out, and he remembered nothing until he stumbled back to camp. Diana helped him to the RV, where he collapsed onto one of the seats, shivering uncontrollably. None of us got any real sleep after that. Chris was furious, suspecting Kevin of staging a prank, but Kevin looked genuinely shaken, too traumatized to concoct such an elaborate ruse. Diana tried to keep the peace, but Chris stormed off for a bit, pacing around camp, muttering curses under his breath. When the sun finally broke through the canopy, it brought little relief. The fog still clung to everything, and the sense of dread remained palpable. Kevin slept most of the morning, wiped out from whatever he'd experienced. Diana, Chris, and I gathered near the campfire. We decided we needed to figure out what to do. Chris wanted to leave immediately, but he also didn't want to appear cowardly or overreacting. Diana, sensing that everyone was near a breaking point, suggested we at least try talking to the park ranger we'd met before. Maybe he could shed some light on these voices. While Kevin rested, we drove the RV toward the park's main station, but the older ranger wasn't there. Another ranger, younger and less experienced, said the senior ranger had left on a routine patrol and might not be back for hours. The younger ranger noted that Redwood is known for minimal incidents, certainly nothing as bizarre as we described. He did, however, give us a pamphlet about local flora and fauna. Diana politely accepted it, but it clearly wasn't going to help. We returned to camp around midday, moods fouled by the lack of answers. The question loomed: should we just pack up and leave? I, in all honesty, was torn. I had come here for photographs, and I still felt a stubborn urge to stay, to conquer whatever fear was pressing in. Kevin insisted half-heartedly that he would be okay. He even tried to crack a joke about, "At least we know redwood witches don't kill you on sight," but his laughter was hollow. Chris and Kevin bickered more that afternoon. Chris accused Kevin of being reckless, and Kevin snapped back that Chris was too uptight, too eager to show off his useless gear. Diana tried to mediate, but it was like they'd each picked a side and refused to budge. Meanwhile, the wind in the branches overhead sounded like soft moaning, and I swore I saw shadows flitting just beyond my peripheral vision. Every so often, that uneasy silence would settle in, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We decided to stay one more night. If anything remotely scary happened again, we'd leave at first light. That evening, I spent time reviewing the photographs I'd taken during the day. Most were fine, but a few had weird, blurred smudges in the corner, like a figure half materialized. It could have been a trick of the light or lens flare, but it gave me goosebumps. While I sat by the RV door scrolling through my camera, Kevin volunteered to gather more firewood. Chris scoffed at the idea. "Haven't you learned your lesson?" "About going out alone?" he barked. Kevin shrugged, said he'd just be a minute, that we couldn't sit in the dark all night. Then he was off. 10 minutes later, we heard Kevin scream. Diana and I bolted up, hearts pounding. Chris grabbed a flashlight and we dashed into the trees. Kevin came stumbling back, holding his wrist like he'd injured it. "Something's out there," he gasped, eyes wild. I saw it. It had my face. It was like me, but not me. Chris demanded a coherent explanation. Kevin insisted he saw a figure in the dark, partially hidden by a tree trunk. At first he thought it was Jill or Diana, until he realized it was wearing his own face. The hair on my arm stood on end. A shapeshifter? Some weird hallucination? Whatever it was, Kevin was clearly terrified, clutching his injured wrist. He said he tripped while backing away from that thing and fell onto a rock. This was enough for Chris. He said we needed to leave, right then and there, no matter how dark it was. Diana agreed, but I wavered. "We should at least wait until morning," I said, though part of me was just too shaken to move at that moment. Driving those winding park roads at night in heavy fog wasn't exactly safe. But Chris insisted. Tensions flared again, a shouting match where Kevin yelled about how he just had the worst scare of his life, and they were acting like this was all his fault. Chris accused Kevin of making it all up again for attention. The two nearly came to blows before Diana physically stepped between them, pleading for calm. In the midst of this argument, a low whistle pierced the air. It was a shrill, eerie note carried on the wind. All four of us froze. It came again, from just beyond our campfire's glow. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Chris swung his flashlight around, but the beam only caught drifting fog, and the trunks of redwood stretching infinitely upward. Kevin backed closer to me, shoulders tense, and Diana inched toward the RV door. Then we heard it. A voice calling, "Kevin." The same whispering lilt we'd heard about the previous night. Only this time, it was followed by something else. A rasping laugh, barely audible, but enough to send my blood ice cold. None of us dared to move. We stared into the darkness for several heartbeats, waiting for something to leap out at us. The Ralph shape emerged from behind a cluster of ferns, illuminated by Chris's flashlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, limbs seeming longer than they should be. Its skin looked pallid, almost gray, and where its face should have been, I saw deep shadows. The horrifying part was the slight tilt of its head, as if it recognized us. The moment it locked onto Kevin, it let out a guttural hiss, then darted back into the forest with inhuman speed, melting into the darkness like a living nightmare. Adrenaline slammed through my veins. We sprinted to the RV and locked every door, our breaths ragged. Kevin pressed his back against the interior, his eyes as round as saucers. Chris gripped the steering wheel, fumbling to start the engine. Diana was in near hysterics, tears welling up as she demanded we drive. The engine roared to life, and we lurched forward. Chris maneuvered through the campsite and onto the narrow road leading out of the park. Fog swallowed the headlights, but he kept going, white-knuckled. The ride was chaotic, with branches scraping the sides of the RV, the wheels occasionally slipping on damp leaves. Several times we nearly slid off into the undergrowth. I kept looking out the window, convinced I'd see that figure running, alongside us, or find its hand pressed against the glass. We managed to get onto a more stable paved road by early morning. Exhaustion swamped us, but none of us wanted to stop until we found somewhere with other people around. Eventually, we located a small diner in a nearby town outside the park boundaries. We parked and slumped in the RV seats, collecting ourselves. Kevin was the first to speak. His voice trembled. He said, "Now you believe me." Chris, still shaken, only nodded. In the daylight, everything felt slightly more manageable, but no less real. We each took turns using the diner restroom to wash up and try to look somewhat presentable. Diana kept repeating that we should have listened to the warnings, that the older ranger's concern was something we should have heeded more carefully. Kevin, sipping a cup of scalding coffee, stared off into space, as if still seeing that twisted figure in front of him. Chris's bravado was gone. He kept his arms folded, jaw clenched, as though trying to keep his emotions in check. We spent the rest of the day driving away from Redwood National Park, each mile feeling like a weight lifting off our chests. The sense of relief was tempered by lingering fear. What was that thing? Were there more of them? Diana whispered that she'd read about forest spirits that can mimic voices or even faces, luring people away from safety. Kevin murmured something about how it wore his face. We all knew we'd never look at those towering redwoods quite the same way again. I keep telling myself that maybe it was just some elaborate hoax, some extremely disturbing prank. But I saw it with my own eyes, and so did Chris. The voice, the sickly pale shape, the way it vanished into the fog, it was no mere trick. Even recalling it now, my stomach knots up, and the hairs on my arms rise. A few days after we got back, I finally mustered the courage to check the photos on my camera in detail. In several frames, there are strange anomalies, almost like partial silhouettes lurking behind trunks or peering around corners. In one particularly chilling shot, taken near the campsite at night, I can discern a set of elongated fingers wrapped around a nearby tree, a sliver of a pale forehead and dark eye just visible. It makes my blood run cold every time I look at it. We haven't really talked about it much since. Chris has apologized to Kevin for doubting him, though there's a rift between them that might never fully mend. Diana still has nightmares, though. She pretends everything is fine. And as for me, I keep wrestling with whether I should share these photos publicly or not. A part of me thinks no one will believe me. Another part is terrified that if people see these pictures, they might go searching for that thing, or worse, it might come searching for me again. I'm writing all this down because I can't hold it in anymore. Every detail remains stark in my memory. The crisp autumn air, the broken lens, the tension around the campfire, Kevin's wild eyes, the scratching on the RV, the voices in the darkness, and that vile, emaciated shape wearing something like a human face. My mind replays the final moments in the park on a loop, the frantic scramble into the RV, the roar of the engine, the stifling fog, and the realization that we were dealing with something beyond our comprehension. If you ever find yourself drawn to Redwood National Park, enamored by the majesty of those ancient trees and the quiet hush of the forest floor, be cautious. There are wonders there, yes, but also things older than any of us can fathom. Things that watch, things that follow. And sometimes they might imitate us, call our names, or even wear our faces in the pale moonlight. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm not sure if I'll ever forget it, or if it will ever truly let me go. My name is Rachel Mendoza. I'm 35 years old, and this happened to me not long ago at Donner Memorial State Park, near Truckee, California. I had recently left a high-pressure corporate job, sold most of my furniture, and set out to see the world, well, at least the western states, by living in my brand new, to me, RV. I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing. I'd read a few articles about how to maintain an RV in cold weather, watched some online tutorials, but deep down, I knew I was flying by the seat of my pants. Still, the promise of solitude, of finally taking a breath away from conference, calls and relentless deadlines had drawn me here. I'd arrived in the late fall, just as the days grew noticeably shorter and the nights brought a lingering chill. The place was stunning during the day, mountains framing the calm waters of Donner Lake, pines swaying in the crisp breeze, and the occasional flurry of snow swirling around. The history, of course, was darker. The Donner Party tragedy loomed over everything, even if you tried not to think about it. Everyone knew the harrowing stories, the desperate measures people took to survive the brutal winter more than a century and a half ago. When I first read up on the park, I assumed the lore would be interesting background noise, but nothing more. The drive to the campground was uncomplicated, though I made slow progress, cautious on the winding roads. My RV had shown a few quirks. Already, an intermittent beep from the battery monitor, a slight water leak whenever I turned on the kitchen tap, but I told myself I'd figure it out. By the time I arrived at the small, relatively empty campground, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky a gold and pink gradient. I pulled into a site tucked beneath tall pines. Only 3 or 4 other campers were dotted around the area, and I could barely see them beyond the branches. Perfect, I thought. I wanted quiet. My first sign of trouble was the battery indicator flashing a warning just as I started to set up for the night. I remember mumbling a few curses under my breath. I could run the generator if needed, but it felt premature to do. So, after fiddling with cables and reading the manual for the 100th time, I managed to get the battery stabilized for the moment. Still, it left me rattled. What would I do if it completely died in the night? It was just after I'd settled that I noticed a scattering of footprints near the lake shore, about 20 yards from where I'd parked. Curious, I jogged over, shining my phone's flashlight on the ground. The prints were small, definitely child-sized. They formed a rough path along the muddy bank, but then they vanished at the water's edge. No adult footprints accompanied them. I remember feeling a pang of unease. Maybe a family had camped here earlier that day, and the kid had been playing near the water. But something about the abrupt end to those prints made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore it. I heated up some soup on my stove, texted a friend to say I'd arrived safely, and jotted down a quick note in my travel journal. The temperature plummeted after sundown, but the heater in my RV hummed reassuringly. Exhausted from the drive, and the stress of my new life on the road, I slipped into my makeshift bed. The quiet of the forest felt like a soft blanket for my ears. No city horns, no neighbors' late-night television, just wind in the trees. It was the first time in ages I felt ready for a full night's rest. Somewhere in the dead of night, I woke to distant laughter. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Children giggling, as if in the middle of a game of tag. I blinked in the darkness, disoriented. There were no lights on in the nearby campsites. The hour must have been well past midnight. The laughter faded, and I told myself I was dreaming. Maybe I'd heard coyotes or owls or the wind making weird echoes. Eventually, I drifted off again, uneasy, but too tired to do much about it. The next morning, I ventured to the visitor center. I wanted to see if I could grab some pamphlets about hiking trails, and also maybe ask about local mechanics, just in case the RV battery trouble escalated. That's where I met Mr. Barber, an older park ranger wearing a worn baseball cap. He was tidying up a brochure stand, moving a big stack of pamphlets about the Donner Party's historical sites. When I asked him about good trails, he studied me more closely than I expected. "You here alone?" he asked. His tone was polite, though concern edged his words. I nodded, admitting that I was camping on my own in my RV. "Late fall can be tricky," he said, as if that explained everything. "Nights get cold real fast. Storms roll in unexpectedly. We sometimes see unusual sightings around this time too. What kind of sightings? I asked, curiosity piqued. He hesitated, then shrugged. Hard to say. Some folks claim they see ghosts of the Donner Party. Others talk about children wandering, calling out to campers, that sort of thing. Usually, folks pack up and leave before we can verify any of it. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out, sounding forced. The memory of those small footprints near the lake reemerged. I thanked him and scooped up the brochures. He gave me a final, weighted look, as though he wanted to caution me more strongly, but held his tongue. While browsing the small gift shop area, I bumped into a young hiker named Cassie, who introduced herself with a warm smile. She noticed the pamphlets in my hand and asked if I was researching the haunted stories. When I asked what she meant, her eyes lit up. Cassie was apparently putting together a podcast about ghost stories and local legends, and she started rattling off tales of phantom children said to roam the Donner Lake shore at dusk. They're rumored to be the ones who didn't survive, Cassie explained. You know, from the Donner Party, the stories say they call out to people, draw them toward the water or deeper into the forest. Some folks claim they can hear them crying, begging for help. My skin prickled. I didn't mention hearing laughter myself, but I asked if she'd ever experienced anything personally. She shrugged. Not yet, but I'm hoping to. That's why I'm camping here for a few days. Going to record some EVPs, maybe capture something eerie for the show. I wished her luck, politely excused myself, and went on my way, though her words stayed in my head. That evening, I tried to focus on my own tasks, checking the RV's plumbing, cooking a simple dinner, journaling about my plan to spend the next day hiking. I told myself I wasn't afraid. But whenever the sun dipped behind the mountains, I found myself glancing at the lake's edge, half expecting to see footprints or children. Sure enough, around twilight, I noticed something odd. On the RV's exterior, handprints, tiny, chalky outlines as though a child had placed their palms against the side. They were spaced out at about a child's shoulder height. My heart jumped, and I instinctively reached for my phone to photograph them. The camera app froze every time I tried to snap a picture. My phone, which had worked fine all day, inexplicably glitched out whenever I lined up the shot. Frustrated and more than a little spooked, I told myself it was just condensation or some random residue. I wiped them away, but as soon as I removed my hand, the prints were completely gone, leaving no trace of moisture or dust. It was like they'd evaporated under my fingertips. I didn't eat much that night. My nerves wouldn't allow it. I locked the RV door firmly, dimmed the interior lights, and tried reading until my eyes drooped. The moment I turned off my lamp, I heard soft tapping at one of the windows. Not scraping, not pounding, just a gentle tap, 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 as though someone with a small hand was politely asking to be let in. Terrified, I barely breathed. The tapping continued for several seconds, then stopped. Gathering courage, I peeked through the curtain. Nothing. There was just the shape of trees, and beyond that, the glow of moonlight reflecting on the lake. I didn't sleep much after that. The following day, I forced myself to take a hike. I needed to distract myself from the relentless sense that something was hovering around my campsite. I followed a moderate trail that wound up a ridge, providing a sweeping view of Donner Lake. The scenery was breathtaking. Clusters of evergreens, patches of lingering snow, a few squirrels darting here and there. For a while, I almost convinced myself that the previous night had been a product of an overactive imagination. I even managed to smile and snap some beautiful photos. But as I descended the ridge, heading back toward the campground in the late afternoon, I spotted fresh footprints again, child-sized, winding along a patch of muddy ground near the main trail. I crouched to examine them, noticing that there was no adult print anywhere near them, no larger shoe size to indicate a parent. The footprints led off the trail, deeper into the woods. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold weather threaded through me. I took out my phone to see if I could get a picture. This time it worked. Sort of. The resulting photo looked hazy, the footprints blurry and indistinct, as if something had disturbed the air around them. I felt a strong urge to follow them, which I resisted by reminding myself how foolish it would be to go off trail with night approaching. I hurried back to the RV. At the campsite, the battery indicator was flashing again, more urgently this time. I groaned, went through the process of recharging it a bit with the generator, and then decided enough was enough. I needed some help. I drove to a nearby station at the park entrance, hoping Mr. Barber might be there. He was. I explained my battery troubles, and though he offered a few suggestions, he also seemed distracted. "You look pale," he said. "You all right? Anything strange happen?" I hesitated. Part of me worried that if I told him about the handprints, the tapping, the footprints, he'd write me off as one of those gullible campers, but my nerves won out, and I spilled the entire story in a quiet rush. He listened intently, nodding in places, his brow furrowed. "You're not the first," he finally said. "There have been reports, always this time of year, late autumn. People hear laughter, see kids near the water, sometimes right at their RV windows. Some of us around here think they're echoes, trapped souls from the Donner Party children, or illusions conjured by the land itself. Either way, it's best to be careful." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you mean, illusions?" He scratched his chin. "I don't rightly know how to explain it, but the stories say they can call out to you, try to lure you. We've had hikers vanish. Usually they're found disoriented, or days later, miles away from the site. Some never turn up at all." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Should I leave?" "That might be wise," he said gently. "But if you're set on staying, keep a close watch after sundown, and if you hear them calling, do not follow." I drove back to my campsite, heart in my throat. The sky was already tinted orange, the sun sneaking behind the mountains. I saw Cassie's tent pitched in a distant spot. She seemed to be adjusting some recording equipment. For a fleeting moment, I considered telling her everything the ranger had said, but she was so enthusiastic about capturing evidence for her podcast, I doubted she'd run. So I just waved, and she waved back, a grin on her face. Darkness was descending, though, and I didn't linger to chat. That night, the tapping started earlier. Around 9 o'clock, just when the forest around Donner Lake became a moonlit tapestry of black trees and silver light, I heard it. Tap, 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 on the passenger side of the RV. Then on the back window, tap, tap, tap. Soft, rhythmic, like a child trying to get my attention. My stomach tightened. I whispered to myself, "Don't open the door. Don't follow any sounds." Then came the laughter, that distant giggling, as though multiple children were playing hide-and-seek just out of sight. I was torn between hiding under my blankets and investigating. Fear won out, and I stayed put, too tense to even turn off my interior lights. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like bare feet running around outside, quick pattering across the dirt. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to pass. Minutes dragged, then I heard them, voices. At first, soft and indistinct, but steadily growing clearer. "We're cold," a child's voice said, not more than a whisper. "We're so cold. Please let us in." My heart lurched. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. They sounded young, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Then I heard another voice, a small girl's, echoing the same phrase. "So cold. Help us, please." I forced myself to remain still. Every maternal instinct in me wanted to open the door, to rescue these kids. But a sharper, primal instinct told me that this was exactly how they lured people out. I thought of Mr. Barber's warning. "They can call out to you." The voices persisted, circling the RV, rising to plaintive cries. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The next sound I heard was a gentle scraping against the door. as if tiny fingernails were testing whether it would open. That horrifying thought nearly undid me. My vision blurred with tears, and I clutched my phone, trying to decide if I should call for help. But who would I call? Eventually, the noises faded. I have no idea how many minutes or hours I stayed there, paralyzed. When I finally felt brave enough to peek out the window, dawn was creeping in, the silhouettes of tall pines becoming visible. My entire body was trembling. I resolved then to leave as soon as I had the energy to gather my things. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As I stepped outside to check my RV's tires, I was greeted by a disturbing sight. More footprints, overlapping each other, encircling my vehicle. Dozens of them, maybe more. A child's foot here, a smaller one there. My breath hitched. I scanned the area. The ground was churned in places, as though multiple children had danced around the RV in the night. Then I noticed something else. My generator cable had been tugged loose. Could be an accident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wanted to prevent me from an easy escape. I hurriedly tried to reattach the cable. The morning sun was rising, and the campground was still quiet. No sign of Cassie. Maybe she was off hiking. The reattachment proved simple enough, but the battery refused to hold a charge. I stared at the blinking red light on the dashboard in despair. Without a properly functioning battery, I couldn't risk driving for any extended period, especially not up these mountain roads in potential freezing weather. I decided to see if Ranger Barber had mechanical advice or a reference for a local service. I drove on low power to the ranger station. There, I found a note pinned to the door stating that Mr. Barber was out on patrol and would return in the afternoon. Great, I thought. I turned to go, but Cassie emerged from a side trail, looking pale and shaken. "Rachel," she called. "It's good to see you. I heard something last night, but when I went outside..." She trailed off, her eyes flicking to the ground. I recorded voices of children. They kept calling my name. I have it on tape. I followed them, trying to get better audio. It led me near the water, but I snapped out of it when the ground got marshy. I nearly fell into the lake. Her hands were trembling on her recording device. She told me she'd also seen footprints that disappeared at the shoreline. She tried to stay calm and rational. She wanted evidence, after all, but admitted she'd never been more frightened in her life. I told her my own experiences, which left us both rattled. We parted ways, and I returned to my site in the hope that Mr. Barber would come by later. I told myself I'd pack up everything so I could move. Out the moment the battery was fixed or replaced. I even considered hitching a ride to a store in Truckee for a new battery, but that would have taken half the day, and the weather forecast hinted at a storm rolling in. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered overhead, the wind picking up. It felt like the entire area was bracing for something. As dusk arrived, I heard the first roll of thunder. I paced inside the RV, every nerve alert. Then came the voices again, drifting between the gusts of wind, blending with the eerie hush of approaching storm. This time they sounded mournful, as though crying softly. I forced myself to ignore it, staying away from the windows. Rain began to patter on the roof. Perfect. A stormy night in a haunted campground. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to my own heart pound. Then, through the wail of the wind, I heard a child sobbing. "Help us. We're hungry." The phrase cut me to the core. My mind flashed to the Donner Party's history, the starvation, the unimaginable horrors they endured. Was that what these voices represented? Echoes of children who never escaped the winter snows? Something in me snapped. I decided I couldn't stand by. I grabbed my flashlight, flung the RV door open, and stepped into the storm. Rain slapped my face, the wind tearing at my jacket. Lightning streaked the sky, illuminating the pines and sending monstrous shadows dancing. The sobbing became clearer, and I followed it around the side of the RV toward the lake. About 20 feet from the shoreline, I saw them, faint silhouettes of children in ragged clothing, outlined by the flash of lightning. Their eyes were dark pits, their faces contorted by hunger or sorrow. The tallest couldn't have been older than 10. They reached their small hands out to me, trembling. My stomach lurched as part of me screamed that this was a trap, that I should run. Another part felt an overwhelming pity for them, these lost souls. Could they truly be ghosts of the children who died all those years ago? One boy stepped forward, his image wavering like a reflection in rippling water. He whispered, "Please, help us." The wind carried his voice, low and thin. Against all logic, I found myself walking closer, tears mixing with rain on my cheeks. "I'm sorry," I choked out, not entirely sure whom I was speaking to. "I'm sorry for what happened to you." The child's expression flickered. A gust of wind nearly knocked me off balance. Lightning cracked again, and for an instant, I saw what lay beneath the illusions. Hollow sockets, skeletal cheeks. Then it reverted to the face of a starving boy. I'm not sure why, but I started speaking aloud, a kind of impromptu prayer. I begged for them to find peace, to let go of this place. The children stared, almost confused. Some of them shrank back from me as if my words, or the raw emotion behind them, threatened to chase them away. The storm intensified, thunder booming overhead. Then they started to fade. One by one, their forms grew transparent, the rain passing through them, until I was left standing in the freezing downpour, chest heaving, tears streaming. I stumbled back to my RV, slammed the door shut, and crumpled onto the floor. My mind spun, trying to process what I'd seen, what I'd done. Did I actually help them? Or did they just disperse for now, only to return the next night? The storm battered the campground for hours, lightning flashing repeatedly. I prayed that my RV wouldn't leak, or that a tree wouldn't topple onto it. When morning finally came, I opened the door to find branches strewn about, puddles everywhere. But the footprints around my site, those endless child tracks, were gone, washed away by the rain. A profound hush blanketed the area, broken only by birds tentatively greeting the new day. As I inspected the RV's battery for the 100th time, I noticed something odd. It was no longer blinking in the red. In fact, it had a decent charge. I tested the engine and it started without a problem. Relief flooded me, though it was tinged with an eerie sense that maybe the forces here had released me to leave. I spent the next hour packing. The storm had passed, and patches of sunlight were breaking through the cloud cover. While storing the last of my gear, I saw Cassie approach, looking exhausted but okay. She quietly asked if I'd seen anything during the storm. I admitted that I had, but I gave no details, only that it was enough to convince me to leave for good. She nodded, hesitating. Then she said she'd captured some audio, children sobbing in the wind, but her device mysteriously erased itself, leaving only static. She looked torn about staying, but I think the fear in my eyes and the sincerity of my words convinced her that some mysteries weren't worth unraveling alone. She said she might leave too once she packed up her tent. Mr. Barber arrived shortly thereafter, checking on campers who might have been impacted by the storm. When he saw me, he just gave a single nod, as though he already knew what had happened. There was no need to explain. He wished me safe travels. I thanked him and climbed into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. As I pulled out of the campground, I glanced one last time at the shimmering waters of Donner Lake. The morning sun made it look almost idyllic, belying the terror I'd experienced. In the passenger side mirror, I thought I caught a flicker of movement among the trees, a small figure in ragged clothing. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I drove away from Donna Memorial State Park with a sense of both relief and profound sadness. Whatever haunted that place might always linger, perhaps as a constant echo of a tragedy so horrific it transcended death. I'm not sure if my words of compassion or my presence in that stormy moment gave those lost children any solace. Part of me hopes they found some measure of peace. Another part fears that they remain, forever wandering, calling out to kind-hearted souls who can't help but be drawn in by cries for help. To this day, I can't fully articulate what happened. Whenever I try to tell the story, I see people's faces shift from curious to skeptical. Yet at night sometimes, I still hear those voices in my dreams, asking me to open a door or follow them into the dark. The memory of those spectral children reminds me that some places bear scars too deep to ever truly heal, and for whatever reason, I became part of their story, if only for a brief, harrowing time. That is what happened to me at Donna Memorial State Park. I'm still on the road, still navigating my RV across different parts of California and beyond, but I've never again stayed anywhere quite so haunted by its history. Even so, a sliver of guilt remains in my heart, an unanswered question. Could I have done more for them? Or was fleeing all I could do to survive? I suppose I'll never know. But there's a certain gratitude in not knowing. Some mysteries, I've learned, are best left locked behind the veil of night, where the restless echoes and the lost remain. And if you ever find yourself alone in the forest near Donna Lake, listening to the quiet stir of trees, remember my story. If you hear small voices calling to you, resist the urge to follow. You might save your own life by doing so, or perhaps you'll save someone else's, and that might be the greatest act of compassion of all.